Hello, I wanted to show you the various books that I'm reviewing and deciding to read. And this is one of them. And I'll show you all of them first. And this is another one. They're all topical. And this is another one. And this is another ongoing one. And this is another one. And this is another one. I have many more, but I'm really loath to be too controversial. So it's difficult to know. I should have let somebody know that I'm on here. I should have done it before I uploaded. But it's never too late, is it? I can actually do it by phone. And if you just bear with me a little bit, I'll just send a message if I can find the right place. I should have planned this. I didn't know that the people who were watching were going to be watching, and they were, and then I switched off. So I'm going to send a message. Yes, I will send a message, otherwise there'll be... So I've sent a message, so I might get somebody to chat with now. But in the meantime, I have to be careful what I'm saying, because I don't want to get banned from YouTube or strikes and that sort of thing. But I want to explain what's in the book that I've put the title up there for, and then I can have a look at the other books. So this book it's about what... I'll tell you who the contributors are. They're David Albert Yates, REINER FUELLMICH, Barbara from Tesco's, Yuri Bezmenov, David Icke, Samantha Louise Yates, I.C. Saturn Anderson, Gavin Wolfe, Robert Kennedy Jr., Raymond T. Gilmore. I know Patricia. Hello, Patricia. Patricia Cusworth, Sarah Debar Warner. They're all contributors. Rudolph Steiner, David Allen, William O'Neill. I know this fellow. Mark Anthony Steele. Hello. David Hollingsworth. Hello. Richard S. Stonemason. Hello. Not a Freemason. Harold Assam, Veronica Baker, Sabrina, Joseph Robbins, Dave Nona, Jeremy Court, Sophie Bleeker, Donna Maria, Vicky Curran, Maximus, this is a good name, Etienne de la Boétie. And you've misspelt my name. You've put an R in it. He's put me as Janet Walmsley-Heron with an R, but it's an L. It's a Lancashire name. Clive Menzies. So, I can read the first page. There's nothing in this that's going to offend any algorithms. Who believes their own perceive? By Yuri Bezmenov, 1984. And he wrote, ideological subversion or psychological warfare changes the perception of reality to such an extent that despite the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interest of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. Basically, this is what it's all about, the history of all of us. Dear people of the future, know your history, or be damned to repeat it. We are living through times whereby the military are our enemy. Science reliant upon defiance has become our enemy. Government are our sworn enemy. Police have become armed. I'm talking worldwide now, as we were disarmed and are now considered foe. Doctors, nurses, hospitals, the entire medical system has turned against us. The farming and food production industries are our enemy. Even so-called religions are now working against our very interests. We've once again fallen to the divide and conquer that accompanies all declared wars. Our own worst enemies, ourselves. When a man is denied the right to live the life he believes in, he has no choice but to become an outlaw. Our story, not history, by David Albert Yeats and others, and I'm one of the others, in 2020. Today's mighty oak is just yesterday's nut that held its ground. David Icke, typical him. The ridiculous 2020 pandemic turned into a second wave twindemic. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Oh dear, we have some very witty contributors in this book of history. It's actually written for our descendants. This is by REINER FUELLMICH. For crimes against humanity they will pay. And I like the first line. It says, I have been practicing law primarily as a trial lawyer against fraudulent corporations such as Deutsche Bank, formerly one of the world's largest and most respected banks. Today is one of the most toxic criminal organizations in the world. Volkswagen, one of the world's largest and most respected car manufacturer, is today notorious for its giant diesel fraud. Kuehne plus Nagel, the world's largest shipping company, are being sued in a multi-million-dollar bribery case. I am a member of the GERMAN Corona Investigative Committee since July the 10th, 2020. Our committee has been listening to a large number of international scientists and experts' testimony to find the answers to the questions about the virus which more and more people worldwide are now asking. All the above mentioned cases of corruption and fraud committed by the German corporations pale in comparison in view of the extent of the damage that this crisis, unnamed, has caused and continues to cause. This crisis, according to all we know today, must be renamed a C, if you know what that stands for, scandal. And those responsible for it must be criminally prosecuted and sued for civil damages. On a political level, everything must be done to make sure that no one will ever again be in a position of such power as to be able to defraud humanity or to attempt to manipulate us with their corrupt agendas. For this reason, I will now explain to you how and where an international network of lawyers will argue this biggest TORT case ever. The, the sea fraud scandal, which has unfolded into probably the greatest crime against humanity ever committed. Crimes against humanity were first defined in connection with the Nuremberg trials after World War II, and when they dealt with the main war criminals of the Third Reich. Crimes against humanity are today regulated in Section 7 of the International Criminal Code. The three major questions to be answered in the context of a judicial approach to the scandal that you know I'm talking about, which I won't mention what it is, but you know what I'm talking about, David and everybody else. Is there a pandemic, or is there only a PCR test pandemic? Specifically, does a positive PCR result mean that the person tested is infected, or does it mean absolutely nothing in connection with the infection? 2. Do the so-called anti-something measures, such as the lockdown, mandatory face covers, social distancing and quarantine regulations, serve to protect the world's population from it? Or do these measures serve only to make people panic so that they believe without asking any questions that their lives are in danger? So that in the end, the pharmaceutical and technical industries can generate huge profits from the sale of PCR tests, antigen and antibody tests, and vaccines, as well as the harvesting of our genetic fingerprints. 3. Is it true that the German government was massively lobbied more so that any other country by the chief protagonists of this so-called pandemic, Mr. Drosten, virologist at the Berlin hospital, Mr. Wheeler, veterinarian and head of the German equivalent of the CDC, the RKI, and Mr. Tedros, head of the World Health Organization, because Germany is known as a particularly disciplined country and was therefore to become a role model for the rest of the world, for it is strict and, of course, successful adherence to those measures. Answers to these three questions are urgently needed because the allegedly new and highly dangerous V has not caused any excess mortality anywhere in the world, and certainly not in Germany. The anti-measures, whose only basis are the PCR test results, which are in turn all based on the German Drosten test, have in the meantime caused the loss of innumerable human lives and have destroyed the economic existence of countless companies and individuals worldwide. In Australia, for example, people are thrown into prison if they do not wear a cover or do not wear it properly as is deemed by the authorities. In the Philippines, people who do not wear one or do not wear it properly in this sense, wait for this one, are getting shot in the head. I wouldn't want to live there. The most important thing in our lawsuit is to establish the facts, to find out what actually happened. That is because the application of the law always depends on the facts at issue. To be able to prosecute someone for fraud, we cannot by presenting the facts of a car accident. So what happened here regarding the alleged pandemic? The investigative committee was founded on 10th of July 2020 by 4 lawyers in order to determine, through hearing expert testimony of international scientists and other experts. How dangerous is it really? 2. What is the significance of a post-positive PCR test? 3. What collateral damage has been caused by the measures, both with respect to the world's population health and with respect to the world's economy? What happened in May 2019 and then in early 2020? And what happened 12 years earlier with the swine flu, which many people have since forgotten about? In May 2019, the stronger of the two parties which govern Germany, in a grand coalition, the CDU, held a congress on world health, apparently at the instigation of important players from the pharmaceutical industry and the tech industry. At this congress, the usual suspects, you might say, gave their speeches. Angela Merkel, she was there, and the German Secretary of Health, Jens Spahn, and some other people whom one would not necessarily expect to be present at such a gathering. Professor Drosten, virologist from the Charity Hospital in Berlin. Professor Wheeler, veterinarian and head of the RKI, which is the equivalent of the German CDC, and Mr. Tedros, philosopher and head of the World Health Organization. They all gave speeches there. Also present and giving speeches were the chief lobbyists of the world's 2 largest health funds, namely Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Wellcome Trust. Less than a year later, these very people called the shots on the proclamation of the worldwide something or other pandemic. They made sure that mass PCR tests were used to prove mass infections with this stuff all over the world, and are now pushing for vaccines to be invented and sold worldwide. These infections, or rather the positive test results that the PCR test delivered, in turn, became the justification for worldwide lockdown, social distancing, mandatory face covers. It is important to note at this point that the definition, a pandemic, was actually changed 12 years earlier. Until then, a pandemic was considered to be a disease that spread worldwide and which led to many serious illnesses and deaths. Suddenly, and for reasons never explained, it was supposed to be a worldwide disease only. Many serious illnesses and many deaths were not required anymore to announce a pandemic. Due to this change, the World Health Organization, which is closely intertwined, the world's pharmaceutical industry, was able to declare the swine flu pandemic in 2009, with the result that vaccines were produced and sold worldwide on the basis of contracts that have been kept secret. These vaccines proved to be completely unnecessary because the swine flu turned out to be a mild flu and never became the horrific plague that the pharmaceutical industry and its affiliated universities kept producing. It would turn into, with millions of deaths certain to happen if people did not get vaccinated. These vaccines also led to serious health problems. At least 700 children in Europe, fell incurably ill with narcolepsy and are now forever severely disabled. Those vaccines bought with millions of taxpayers' monies then had to be destroyed. That's a lot of money gone down the drain then. Whew. With even more of taxpayers' monies. Already then, the swine flu, the German virologist Drosten was one of those who stirred up panic in the population, repeating over and over and over again that the swine flu would claim many hundreds of thousands, even millions of deaths all over the world. In the end, it was mainly to Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg and his efforts as a member of the German Bundestag and also a member of the Council of Europe that this hoax was brought to an end before it would lead to even more serious consequences. Fast forwards to March of this year, 2020, when the German Bundestag announced an epidemic situation of national importance, which is the German equivalent of a pandemic in March 2020, based on this lockdown, with the suspension of all essential constitutional rights. For an unforeseeable time, there was only one single opinion on which the federal government in Germany based its decision. The only person they listened to was Mr. Drosten, the very person whose horrific panic-inducing prognosis proved to be catastrophically false 12 years earlier. We know this because a whistleblower member of the Green Party told on 29th of August 2020 in Berlin, in the context of an event at which Robert F. Kennedy Jr. also took part, and at which both men gave speeches, and he did so afterwards in one of the sessions of this so-called committee. The reason he did this is that he had become increasingly skeptical about the official narrative propagated by politicians and the mainstream media. He had therefore undertaken an effort to find out about other scientists' opinions and had found them on the internet. There he realized that there were a number of highly renowned scientists who held a completely different opinion which contradicted the horrific prognosis of Mr. Drosten. They assumed, and still do assume, that there was no disease that went beyond the gravity of the seasonal flu, that the population had already acquired cross or T-cell immunity against this allegedly new virus, and that there was therefore no reason for any special measures, and certainly not for vaccinations. These scientists include Professor John Ioannidis of Stanford University in California. He is a specialist in statistics and epidemiology, as well as public health, and at the same time the most quoted scientists in the world, Professor Michael Levitt, Nobel Prize winner for chemistry, and also a biophysicist at Stanford University, and many other scientists and doctors worldwide, including Dr. Mike Eden, the former vice president and scientific director of Pfizer, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. I think they're well known. At the end of March, beginning of April 2020, Mr. Cyber, S-I-B-E-R, turned to the leadership of his Green Party with the knowledge he had accumulated and suggested that they present these other scientific opinions to the public and explain that contrary to Mr. Drosten's doomsday prophecies, there was no reason for the public to panic. Incidentally, Lord Sumption, oh, he's a lovely chap, isn't he, who served as a judge at the British Supreme Court from 2012 to 2018, had done the very same thing at the very time that it had come to the same conclusion, that there was no factual basis for panic and no legal basis for those measures. Likewise, the former president of the German Federal Constitutional Court expressed albeit more cautiously, serious doubts that the measures were constitutional, instead of taking notes of these other opinions and discussing them with David Seiber, Sibeber. The Green Party leadership declared that Mr. Drosten's panic messages were good enough for the Green Party. Remember, they are not a member of the ruling coalition. They are the opposition. Still, that was enough for them, just as it has been good enough for the federal government as a basis for its lockdown decision, they said. Subsequently, the Green Party leadership called David Seiber a conspiracy theorist without ever having considered the content of his information, and then stripped him of his mandates. So let us now look at the current actual situation regarding the dangers. The complete uselessness of PCR tests for the detection of infections and the lockdowns based on non-existent infections. In the meantime, we know that the healthcare systems were never in danger of becoming overwhelmed by it. On the contrary, many hospitals remain empty to this day, and some are now facing bankruptcy. The hospital ship Comfort, which anchored in New York at the time and could have accommodated 1,000 patients, never accommodated more than some 20 patients. Now, where was there any excess mortality? Studies carried have shown that the mortality is equivalent to that of the seasonal flu. Even the pictures from Bergamo, I've been there, and New York, that were used to demonstrate to the world that panic was in order, proved to be deliberately misleading. Then the so-called panic paper was leaked, which was written by the German Department of the Interior. It has classified content and shows that beyond a shadow of doubt that in fact the population was deliberately driven to panic by politicians and mainstream media in Germany. The accompanying irresponsible statements of the head of the RKI, Mr. Wheeler, who repeatedly and excitedly announced that the measures must be followed unconditionally by the population, without them asking any question, shows that he followed the script verbatim. In his statements, he kept announcing that the situation was very grave and threatening. Here my ducks out there, they want demanding food. They've eaten loads of it and I have to go and buy more, but they're so greedy. I've got no more to give them, but they come and out the window. Oh, what are they like? Let me read back that last bit. In his statements, he kept announcing that the situation was very grave and threatening, although the figures compiled by his own institute proved the exact opposite. Among other things, the panic paper calls for children to be made to feel responsible for the painful, tortured death of their parents and grandparents if they do not follow the rules. That is, if they do not wash their hands constantly and do not stay away from their grandparents. Just to clarify, in Bergamo, the majority of deaths, 94% to be exact, turned out to be the result not of that, but rather the consequence of the government deciding to transfer sick patients sick with probably the cold or seasonal flu from hospitals to nursing homes in order to make room at the hospitals for all the other patients who ultimately never arrived there. The infected old people with a severely weakened immune system, usually as a result of pre-existing medical conditions, in addition flu vaccination, which had previously been administered, had further weakened their immune systems of the people in the nursing homes. However, in New York, only some, but by far not all hospitals, were overwhelmed. Many people, most of whom were again elderly and had serious pre-existing medical conditions, and most of whom, had it not been for the panic mongering, would have just stayed at home to recover, instead raced to the hospitals. There many of them fell victim to healthcare associated infections or nosocomial infections on the one hand, and incidents of malpractice on the other hand. For example, by being put on a respirator rather than receiving oxygen through an oxygen mask. To further clarify that it is a dangerous disease, just like the seasonal flu is a dangerous disease, and of course, just like seasonal flu may sometimes take a severe clinical course and will sometimes kill patients. However, as autopsies have shown, which were carried out in Germany in particular by the forensic scientist Professor Klaus Puschel in Hamburg, the fatalities he examined had almost all been caused by serious pre-existing conditions, and almost all of the people who had died at a very old age, just like in Italy, meaning they had lived beyond their average life expectancy. The German, I'm getting a bit cold, excuse me. Got to put some heat, I had my heat off, but it's feeling chilly now. Maybe it's late in the day or I'm getting older and old. Okay, reading about old people makes me feel older than I am old. So let me get back to here. The German RKI, the equivalent of the CDC, all these abbreviations do your brain in, had initially, strangely enough, recommended that no autopsies be performed, and there are numerous credible reports that doctors and hospitals worldwide had been paid money for declaring a deceased person a victim of whatever it is, you know what it is, rather than writing down the true cause of death on the death certificate. For example, a heart attack or a gunshot wound. Without the autopsies, we would never know that the overwhelming majority of the alleged victims had died of completely different diseases, but not of the said one. The assertion that the lockdown was necessary because there were so many different infections with SARS and CoV-2, and because the healthcare systems would be overwhelmed, is wrong for the three reasons we learned about from the hearings conducted with this so-called committee, and from other data that has become available in the meantime. 1. The lockdown was imposed when the virus was already retreating. By the time the lockdown was imposed, the alleged infection rates were already dropping again. 2. There is already protection from the virus because of cross or T-cell immunity. Apart from the above-mentioned lockdown being imposed when the infection rates were already dropping, there is also cross or T-cell immunity in the general population against this sort of what we've been talking about for so long. I've forgotten what year it started. Okay, did you get that? Contained in every flu or influenza wave. This is true, even if this time around a slightly strain of the so-called was at work, and that is because the body's own immune system remembers every virus it has ever battled in the past. Oh, what a clever system God made. Oh, God created an immune system that remembers everything that attacks it. Yes. Yes. Remembers every virus it has ever battled in the past. Isn't that wonderful? And from this experience, it also recognizes a supposedly new but still similar strain of the virus from that same family, because they're all a group of them. You know, I don't have to name it because there's a group of them. They're all in a bundle together, but they've all got different numbers. Incidentally, that is how the PCR test for the detection of an infection was invented by now infamous Professor, guess who? Drosten. At the beginning of January 2020, based on this very basic knowledge, Mr. Drosten developed his PCR test, which supposedly detects an infection with SARS-CoV-2 without it ever having seen the real China from China, only having learned from social media reports that there was something going on in China. He started tinkering on his computer with what would become his PCR test. For this, he used an old SARS virus, any old thing will do, hoping it would be sufficiently similar to the allegedly new strain of this whatever it was from China. Then he sent the result of his computer tinkering to China to determine whether the victims of the alleged new whatever it was tested positive. They did, and that was enough for the World Health Organization to sound the pandemic alarm, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong, and to recommend the worldwide use of the Drosten PCR test, the very man that caused all these other issues. He's a flipping nutcase, should have been sacked for the detection of infections with the virus now called SARS-CoV whatever it was, 2. Drosten's opinion, which it's not worth anything, and advice was, and this must be emphasized. How they say it in Germany? Emphasized. Is that how they say it in Germany? Emphasized. Oh dear. The only source for the German government when it announced the lockdown, as well as the rules, the social distancing and the mandatory cover-ups, and this must also be emphasized once again, Germany apparently became the center of especially massive lobbying by who? The pharmaceutical and tech industry, because the world was with reference to the allegedly disciplined Germans who should do as the Germans do in order to survive the pandemic. 3. PCR test is being used on the basis of false statements, not based on scientific facts with respect to infections. In the meantime, we have learned that these PCR tests, contrary to the assertion of Drosten Wheeler and the WHO, I used to go and watch WHO concerts, do not give any indication of an infection with any virus, let alone an infection with SARS-CoV-2. Not only are PC tests not approved for diagnostic purposes, as is correctly noted on leaflets coming with these tests, and as the inventor of the PCR test, Carrie Mullis, has repeatedly emphasized, instead, they are simply incapable of diagnosing any disease, contrary to the assertions of Drosten, Wheeler, and the WHO, which they have been making since the proclamation of the pandemic. A positive PCR test does not mean that an infection is present. If someone tests positive, it does not mean that they are infected with anything, let alone a contagious SARS-CoV-2 whatever virus. Even the United States CDC institution says, and dated July 13th, 2020, detection of viral RNA may not indicate the presence of infectious virus or that 29-NCoV is the causative agent for clinical symptoms. The performance of this test has not been established for monitoring treatment of two-threat 2019 NCoV infection. This test cannot rule out diseases caused by other bacterial or viral pathogens. It is still not clear whether there has ever been a scientifically correct isolation of the China virus, so that nobody knows exactly what we are looking for when we test, especially since this virus, just like flu virus, mutates quickly. The PCR swabs take one or two sequences of a molecule that are invisible to the human eye and therefore need to be amplified in many cycles to make visible. Everything over 35 cycles is as reported by the New York Times and others considered completely unreliable and scientifically unjustifiable. However, the Drosten test, as well as the WHO recommended tests that followed his example, are set to 45 cycles. Can that be because of a desire to produce as many positive results as possible and thereby provide the basis for the false assumption that a large number of infections have been detected? The test cannot distinguish inactive and reproductive matter. That means that a positive result may happen because the test detects, for example, a piece of debris, a fragment of a molecule, which may signal nothing else than that the immune system of the person tested won a battle with a common cold in the past. Even Drosten himself declared in an interview with a German business magazine in 2014, at that time, concerning the alleged detection of an infection with MERS virus, Middle East respiratory syndrome, allegedly, with the help of the PCR tests, that these PCR tests are so highly sensitive that even very healthy and non-infectious people may test positive. At that time, he also became very much aware of the powerful role of the panic and fear-mongering media. He said then in this interview, if, for example, such a pathogen scurries over the nasal mucosa of a nurse for a day or so without her getting sick or noticing anything, then she's suddenly a MERS case. This could also explain the explosion of case numbers in Saudi Arabia. In addition, the media there have made this into an incredible sensation. Has he forgotten this? Or is he deliberately concealing this in the corona context? Did I say that word? Oh dear, because it's a very lucrative business. I never meant to say that word. Opportunity for the pharmaceutical as a whole. It is completely implausible that he forgot in 2020 that he knew about the PCR tests and told the business magazine in 2014. In short, this test cannot detect any infection, contrary to all false claims stating that it can. An infection, a so-called hot infection, requires that the virus, or rather a fragment of a molecule, which may be a virus, is not just found somewhere, for example, in the throat of a person without causing any damage. That would be a cold infection. Rather, a hot infection requires that the virus penetrates into the cells, replicates there, and causes symptoms such as headaches or a sore throat. Only then is a person really infected in the sense of a hot infection, because only then is a person contagious, that is able to infect others. Until then, it is completely harmless for both the host and all other people that the host comes into contact with. Once again, this means that positive test results, contrary to all other claims by Drosten, Wheeler of the WHO, mean nothing with respect to infections, as even the CDC knows. CDC, Center for Disease Control. A number of highly respected scientists worldwide assume there has never been a C pandemic, but only a PCR test pandemic. Many German scientists conclude all the above. The most recent opinion is that of Dr. Mike Yeadon, a former vice president and chief science officer at Pfizer, who held his position for 16 years. He and his co-authors, all well-known scientists, published a scientific paper in September of 2020, and he wrote a corresponding magazine article on September 20th, 2020. Among other things, he and they state, "We are basing our government policy, our economic policy, and the policy of restricting fundamental rights, presumably on completely wrong data and assumptions about this virus. If we were not for the test results that are constantly reported in the media, the pandemic would be over, because nothing really happened. Of course, there are some serious individual cases of illness, but There are also some in every flu epidemic. There was a real wave of disease in March and April, but since then, everything has gone back to normal. Only the positive results rise and sink wildly again and again, depending on how many tests are carried out. But the real cases of illnesses are over. There can be no talk of a second wave. The allegedly new strain of this virus is only new in that it is a new type of the long-known so-called virus. There are at least 4 viruses that are endemic and cause some of the common colds which we experience, especially in winter. They all have a striking sequence, similarity to that virus, and because the human immune system recognizes the similarity to that virus, that has now allegedly been newly discovered. A T-cell immunity has long existed in this respect. 30% of the population had this before the allegedly new virus even appeared. Therefore, it is sufficient for the so-called herd immunity that 15 to 25% of the population are infected with the allegedly new virus to stop the further spread of the virus, and this has long been the case. Regarding all the important PCR tests, Yeadon writes in a piece called Lies, Damned Lies, and Health Statistics, The Deadly Danger of False Positives, dated 20th September 2020. The likelihood of an apparently positive case being a false positive is between 89 to 94% or near certainty. Dr. Yeadon, in agreement with the professors of immunology from Germany, Netherlands, Ireland, and a microbiologist from Austria, all of whom testified before the German committee, explicitly points out that a positive test does not mean that an intact virus has been found. The authors explain that what the PCR test actually measures is simply the presence of RNA sequences present in the intact virus, which could be a piece of dead virus, which cannot make the subject sick and cannot be transmitted and cannot make anyone else sick. Because of the complete unsuitability of the test for the detection of infectious diseases, tested positive in goats, sheep, papayas, and even chicken wings, Oxford professor Carl Hennigan, director of the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, writes that the COVID virus would never disappear if this test practice were to be continued, but it would always be falsely detected in much of what is tested. Lockdowns, as Yaden and his colleagues found out, do not work. Sweden, with its laissez-faire approach, and Great Britain, with its strict lockdown, for example, have completely comparable disease and mortality statistics. The same was found by US scientists concerning the different US states. It makes no difference to the incidence of disease whether a state implements a lockdown or not. With regard to the now infamous Imperial College of London's Professor Neil Ferguson and his completely false computer models warning of millions of deaths, he says that no serious scientists give any validity to Ferguson's model. He points out with thinly veiled contempt the importance of knowing that most scientists do not accept that Ferguson's model was even faintly right. But the government is still wedded to the model Ferguson predicted. 40,000 deaths in Sweden by May and 100,000 by June, but it remained at 5,800, which according to the Swedish authorities is equivalent to a mild flu. If the PCR test had not been used as a diagnostic tool for infections, there would not be a pandemic and there would be no lockdowns, but everything would have been perceived as just a medium or light wave of influenza, these scientists conclude. Dr. Yaden, in his piece, Lies, Damned Lies, and Health Statistics, The Deadly Danger of False Positives, writes, "This test is fatally flawed and must immediately be withdrawn and never used again in this setting unless shown to be fixed." Towards the end of that article, I have explained how a hopelessly performing diagnostic test has been and continues to be used not for diagnosis of disease, but it seems solely to create fear. So let us now look at the current actual situation regarding the severe damage caused by the lockdowns and other measures. Another detailed paper written by a German official in the Department of the Interior, who is responsible for risk assessment and the protection of the population against risks, was leaked recently. It is now called the false alarm paper. This paper comes to the conclusion that there was and is no sufficient evidence for serious health risks for the population as claimed by the Drosten, Wheeler and World Health Organization. But the author says there is very much evidence of these measures causing gigantic health and economic damage to the population, which he then describes in detail in this paper. This, he concludes, will lead to very high claims for damages, which the government will be held responsible for. This has now become reality, but the paper's author was suspended. More and more scientists, but also lawyers, recognize that as a result of the deliberate panic mongering and the so-called measures enabled by this panic, democracy is in great danger of being replaced by fascist, totalitarian models. In Australia, people who do not wear, which more and more studies show and prove to be hazardous to health, or who do not wear them correctly, are arrested, handcuffed, and thrown into jail. In the Philippines, they run the risk of getting shot. But even in Germany and other previously civilized countries, children are taken away from their parents if they do not comply with quarantine regulations, distance regulations, and face-wearing regulations. That's awful. According to psychologists and psychotherapists who testified before these committees, children are traumatized en masse, with the worst psychological consequences yet to be expected in the medium and long term. In Germany alone, 500,000 to 800,000 bankruptcies are expected in the fall to strike small and medium-sized businesses, which form the backbone of the economy. This will result in incalculable tax losses and incalculably high and long-term Social Security money transfers for, among other things, unemployment benefits, since in the meantime, pretty much everybody is beginning to understand the full devastating impact of the completely unfounded so-and-so, so-forth measures. I will refrain from detailing this any further or even using the name. I'm not using the name, but you can assume what name I mean. The most difficult part of a lawyer's work is always to establish the true facts, not the application of the legal rules to these facts. A court of law can only decide a legal dispute correctly if it has previously determined the facts correctly, which is not possible without looking at all the evidence. That is why the law of evidence is so, important. On the basis of the facts summarized above, which has taken over an hour, particularly those established with the help of the work of the German So-So Committee, the legal evaluation is actually simple. It is simple for all civilized legal systems, regardless of whether these legal systems are based on civil law, which follows the Roman law more closely, or whether they are based on Anglo-American common law, which is only loosely connected to Roman law. Let us take a look at the unconstitutionality of the measures. A number of German law professors have stated either in handwritten expert opinions or in interviews, in line with the serious doubts expressed by the former president of the Constitutional Court with respect to the constitutionality of the so-called unmentioned, what we're dealing with, subject measures here, that these measures are without a sufficient factual basis and also without a sufficient legal basis, and are therefore unconstitutional and must be repealed immediately. That means our MPs and German MPs back in place, and not one person making decisions, but the whole of the parliament system. All of the elected representatives of the people need to be making decisions. That's what it means. They are therefore unconstitutional and must be repealed immediately. Very recently, a judge declared publicly that the German judiciary, just like the general public, has been so panic-stricken that it was no longer able to administer justice properly. He says that the courts of law have all too quickly waved through coercive measures, which for millions of people all over Germany represent massive suspensions of their constitutional rights. He points out that German citizens are currently experiencing the most serious encroachment of their constitutional rights since the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1949. In order to contain this alleged so-called pandemic, federal and state governments have intervened massively and in part threatening the very existence of the country as it is guaranteed by the constitutional rights of the people. What about fraud, intentional infliction of damage, and crimes against humanity based on the rules of criminal law, asserting false facts concerning the PCR tests or intentional risk misrepresentation as it was committed by Drosten, Wheeler and the WHO can only be assessed as fraud based on the rules of civil tort law, TORT. This translates into intentional infliction of damage. The German professor of civil law, Martin Schwab, 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 supports this finding in public interviews in a comprehensive legal opinion of around 180 pages. He has familiarized himself with the subject matter like no other legal scholar has done thus far, and in particular has provided a detailed account of the complete failure of the mainstream to report on the true facts of this so-called pandemic. Mr. Drosten, Wheeler and Tedros of the WHO all knew, based on their own expertise or the expertise of their institutions, that the PCR tests cannot provide any information about infections, but asserted over and over again to the general public that they can, with their counterparts all over the world, repeating this, and they all knew and accepted that on the basis of their recommendations, the governments of the world would decide on lockdowns, the rules for social distancing, and mandatory wearing of whatever over your kibosh, the latter representing a very serious health hazard, as more and more independent studies and expert statements show. Under the rules of civil tort law, TORT law, all those who have been harmed by these PCR tests induced lockdowns are entitled to receive full compensation for their losses. In particular, there is a duty to compensate, that is a duty to pay damages for the loss of profits suffered by companies and self-employed persons as a result of the lockdown and other measures. In the meantime, however, the anti-so-and-so what we're talking about measures have caused and continue to cause such devastating damage to the world's population, health and economy that the crimes committed by Mr. Drosten, Wheeler and the World Health Organization must be legally qualified as actual crimes against humanity as defined in Section 7 of the Criminal Code. How can we do something? What can we do? Well, the class action is the best route to compensatory damages and to political consequences. The so-called class action lawsuit is based on English law and exists today in the USA and in Canada. It enables a court of law to allow complaint for damages to be tried as a class action lawsuit at the request of a plaintiff if 1. As a result of a damage-inducing event to a large number of people suffer the same type of damage. Phrased differently, a judge can allow a class action lawsuit to go forward if common questions of law and facts make up the vital component of the lawsuit. Here the common questions of law, in fact, revolve around the worldwide PCR test, based lockdowns, and its consequences. Just like VW diesel passenger cars were functioning products, but they were defective due to a so-called defeat device because they did not comply with the emission standards. So too, the PCR tests, which are perfectly good products in other settings, are defective products when it comes to the diagnosis of infections. If an American or Canadian company or an American or Canadian individual decides to sue these persons in the United States or Canada for damages, then the court called upon to resolve this dispute may, upon request, allow this complaint to be tried as a class action lawsuit. If this happens, all affected parties worldwide will be informed about this through publications in the mainstream media and will thus have the opportunity to join this class action within a certain, I've got an itch on my arm, period of time. To be determined by the court. It should be emphasized that nobody must join the class action, but every injured party can join the class. The advantage of the class action is that only one trial is needed, namely to try the complaint of a representative plaintiff who is affected in a manner typical of everyone else in the class. This is firstly cheaper and secondly faster than hundreds of thousands or more lawsuits, and thirdly, it imposes less of a burden on the courts. Fourthly, as a rule, it allows a much more precise examination of the accusations than would be possible in the context of hundreds of thousands or more likely in this corona setting. Say that word, strike it off. Setting even millions of individual lawsuits. In particular, the well-established and proven Anglo-American law of evidence, with its pre-trial discovery, is applicable. This requires that all evidence relevant for the determination of the lawsuit is put on a table. In contrast to the typical situation in German lawsuits, with a structural imbalance, that is, lawsuits involving on the one hand a consumer, on the other hand a powerful corporation. The withholding or even destruction of evidence is not without consequence. Rather, the party withholding or even destroying evidence loses the case under these evidence rules. In Germany, a group of TORT lawyers have banded together to help their clients' recovery of damages. They have provided all relevant information and forms for German plaintiffs to both estimate how much damage they have suffered and join the group of class of plaintiffs who will later join the class action when it goes forward, either in Canada or the US. Initially, this group of lawyers had considered to also collect and manage the claims for damages of other non-German plaintiffs, but this proved to be unmanageable. However, through an international lawyers network, which is growing larger by the day, the German group of attorneys provides to all their colleagues in other countries, free of charge, all relevant information, including expert opinions and testimonies of experts showing that the PCR tests cannot detect infections, and they also provide them with all relevant information as to how they can prepare and bundle the claims for damages for their clients, so that they too can assert their clients' claims for damages, either in their home countries of law or within the framework of the class action, as explained previously. These scandalous facts, gathered mostly by the committee and summarized above, are the very same facts that will soon be proven to be either in one court of law or in many courts of law all over the world. These are the facts that will pull those things off their faces of all those responsible for these crimes. To the politicians who believe those corrupt people, these facts are hereby offered as a lifeline that can help you readjust your course of action and start long overdue public scientific discussion and not go down with those charlatans and criminals. That is the end of that. So, I shall read that ugly faced one next. That is the end of that. And I never knew it was going to take so long. There are things in there that obviously are extremely serious. And I used to watch years ago when I was very young a program called That Was the Week That Was. So I put a bit of the week that was style in there because that's the way the word, it wasn't planned, any of that. The words hit me that way, and that's why I recorded it that way in certain areas. But I did take the whole thing seriously, but some of it got to me and I had to react to how it got to me in a certain way, because the truth sometimes is ridiculous. It really is. And I'm not going to say anything because I only wanted to read that lawyer's words, and I don't want to put my own in and cause a problem. I know I've had one person looking, but one thinks that might be a computer. You don't know if it's a real person. I know when I did the other one just now, there were 4 or 2 or however many. But it's important. That information has to be out there somehow or other. I didn't know it was going to take so long. But hopefully it'll be out there, because after it's recorded live, something happens to it. Not quite sure how it works. And then it can be found. So hopefully this one will be found. Certainly I know people who'd like to hear it, but I couldn't tell them I was going to do it because I never knew that I was going to do this live just now. Otherwise I would have let them know. But I can tell them that it's recorded. So anyway, there will be more from this book. Yep. But I don't know when. They're all by different people. As I say, at the very beginning, I read out all the contributors, and then this is the first one in the book, apart from the other 2. But this one was important. I can give you the name. The Crimes Against Humanity by REINER FUELLMICH. REINER FUELLMICH. He's a practicing trial lawyer. Yeah. All right. Thank you for listening. God bless. Goodbye. See you next time.